In his series, A Song of Ice and Fire, George R.R. Martin is able to write in a way that makes you, as the reader, feel like what you are witnessing is truly epic. I don't just mean epic as in the genre definition of epic fantasy, and I don't mean the origins of the word meaning a long poem or story. I mean the more modern definition of the word as in something that is huge in scale. A Song of Ice and Fire feels huge. When you are reading it, you truly feel like so much is happening, like the world is deep, and from the farmers to the kings, every single person has a full life that means something in the world. And a lot of things contribute to this feeling. The amount of history Martin layers into the text helps, as does literally what is happening in the plot. The politics that affects whole continents, dragons, the magic that has wild consequences, all that contributes to it. But that's not what I want to talk about today. I'm A.A. Watson, author of The Living Weapon, and in this video I want to look at the lesser spoken about writing techniques that Martin uses across the Song of Ice and Fire series to add to that epic feeling, and it has nothing to do with the plot, character development, or even the themes. Let's get into it. George R.R. Martin is a master at how he structures his chapters. Literally, the way he structures the chapters adds to the epicness of the story. I call it a snapshot chapter because each chapter is like a snapshot of a person's life. It jumps into something they are doing, starting mid-scene. It focuses on one specific portion in that person's life per chapter, and then it usually ends with something unresolved, either within the character or in the plot. The way they are written gives such a cinematic feel, similar to the way a movie or TV show with an ensemble cast jumps around from character to character and storyline to storyline. On a side note, I don't believe that is a coincidence, since George R.R. Martin had much of his early career writing for television, and I believe that has always been his ultimate goal. You can see it in the way he writes. Each chapter covers a certain amount of time, covers a certain important event, and then it ends without completely tying up all loose ends. Then goes to the next chapter, jumping to a different point of view across kingdoms. Let's look at this example chapter from A Clash of Kings, the second book in the series, chapter 8, which is Tyrion's second point of view chapter. It opens with this line: Janos Slynt was a butcher's son, and he laughed like a man chopping meat. More wine? Tyrion asked him. Many writers make the mistake of starting chapters with characters waking up, or perhaps getting ready for something to happen, but you see here we are thrown straight into it. Martin here has actually used two techniques that I like to use to start chapters, or more like two versions of the same technique, just at different levels. They are starting mid-scene and starting mid-motion. Starting mid-scene means that the overarching set piece is already underway before the chapter has actually started. In this example, Tyrion and Janos Slynt are already mid-conversation. The second version of this technique is starting mid-action, as in an action is literally taking place, and in this case it is Janos Slynt's laugh being described. It's not literally saying he is laughing at this moment, but it describes his laugh, which is an action, instead of, for example, describing the table, which is static. Both these techniques create immediate momentum as we move into this new chapter. It pulls the reader in immediately, and they are just flowing along, wanting to find out what is going on. And the beauty of it is once you pull the reader in like that, you can then backfill with any information necessary for the reader to have a broader context and understanding of what is actually going on. And that's exactly what happens later in the chapter as we are caught up on the meal that has been going on between Tyrion and Janos Slynt. After this conversation, Tyrion ends up sending Janos Slynt to the wall for what he did to the previous hand, Ned Stark. And then Varys comes in and they start talking. Now this leads me into what this chapter is covering. What is the snapshot of Tyrion's life that this chapter gives to us? Well, it is showing us him settling into his position as Hand of the King. That is the focus of the chapter. The whole chapter has one focus. It goes from Janos Slynt to Varys and then after that to Bronn. This essentially forms a mini arc of task to task to task that Tyrion is handling, and we get to see how he is ruling, how he is handling decisions, and how those decisions are affecting him internally. And then that leads us to the end of the chapter. A good ending to a chapter, and what Martin does often, is more of a start line than a finish line. What I mean by that is when a chapter wraps up cleanly and resolves all immediate tension, the reader will feel like they have come to a conclusion, and then there is less of a need for them to keep wanting to turn the page to the next chapter. Martin is wonderful at making sure that does not happen, because he either ends a chapter on an external unresolved tension or an internal unresolved tension. In this chapter, it is internal. Here it is. He wanted to laugh, he wanted to weep, most of all, he wanted Shae. What's happened in this chapter has mostly been resolved for now. He made all the decisions he had to make. However, what hasn't been resolved is Tyrion's internal state. He is drunk, he is tired, and he has worries. He knows that the last two hands both died. He knows that King's Landing is a pit of vipers, but he just wants comfort. He has resolved the external conflicts for now, but the internal conflict within him, the tension he feels, and therefore we feel, is not resolved, and so he wants Shae to help resolve that tension. However, we don't see that. Instead, it ends on that thought. That's an example of an internal unresolved thread within a character. An example of an external unresolved thread related to plot would be chapter 37 in A Feast for Crows, which is Brienne's 7th chapter when she fights Biter. It ends with her badly hurt, and it says this: Biter threw back his head and opened his mouth again, howling, and stuck his tongue out at her. It was sharply pointed, dripping blood, longer than any tongue should be, sliding from his mouth out and out and out, red and wet and glistening. It made a hideous sight, obscene. His tongue is a foot long, Brienne thought, just before the darkness took her. Why? It looks almost like a sword. Need I say more? That is the perfect example of a chapter ending with a quiet revelation. It is a simple, almost understated sentence that we know has pretty big implications, but the chapter stops before that tension that was just created with us wondering what is happening and who is saving Brienne is resolved. And that is how Martin ends his chapters. The chapter structure that I have gone through does a lot of things for the book. I have mentioned a few of them here, but the reason why all of this contributes to the epic feeling of the books is because every time a chapter starts, we immediately feel like we have to catch up since the characters are already on the move. And every time we end a chapter, we are eager to know more because we know that the characters are continuing to move on. Each character feels like they are not just there on the page for our enjoyment. It feels like they are real people living their real lives, and we just have the opportunity to jump into their lives and see what is happening at different points. This is what creates the epic scale. The world doesn't pause when you are not reading about it. It exists beyond the page, and the way Martin writes, from the plot elements to the way the characters speak to the structure of the chapters themselves, makes sure that we don't just intellectually know that, but that we truly feel that. And the point of view structure continues to reinforce it. We know what is happening for a certain time in someone's life within the wider workings of the kingdoms, and then we jump to another person. However, the chapters for the same character do not start from where the last one finished. Time continues. So at any given moment, we know there are perspectives and events and storylines that we are not actively participating in, but know are happening, and at any one time we can only witness what is being witnessed by the specific character we are following. It truly is like cutting between scenes in a film or a prestige TV show, and it works so well. However, there is something else that Martin does that makes sure that the writing scene to scene matches the epicness of what the overall structure of the chapters create, and that is how he very carefully manages the pacing of the chapters. Martin knows exactly what to write out in full detail and exactly what to skip over. He can pass by days in one sentence or a moment in 5 pages, but it all works smoothly. He is very focused on expanding and taking time in the moments that need to land because they have multiple jobs usually, but then compressing everything else that isn't as important. A great example that stood out to me is in the first book, A Game of Thrones, chapter 59, Catelyn's 9th chapter, when she goes to speak with Lord Walder Frey. She is going to negotiate with him so that he will allow her son, Robb's army, to pass from the north to the south. Catelyn starts the conversation with Lord Frey on page 620, at least in my version of the book. Different versions might have slightly different page numbers, but the point remains the same. On page 620, they start conversing. This conversation does a lot of things. It shows Lord Frey's character, tells us more about the Frey house, tells us their standing in the kingdoms, explains the connection between Catelyn and Frey, explains more about past events that have happened, and it goes on for a few pages. On page 625, this conversation comes to an end. However, none of the actual negotiation has really happened yet. After pages of that essentially introductory conversation, we get one line that functions as the rest of the conversation. The rest was only haggling. Martin found it important to properly introduce Frey and multiple plot and character elements in the beginning of the conversation, which, in story, was the shortest part, and then manages to go through the rest of the rather long conversation in one short sentence. He chooses exactly what gets page space and what doesn't, and by doing this carefully, Martin is able to have complete control over time that passes in each chapter. So we can have chapters that follow one moment or one day or weeks at a time, and it is always completely smooth. All these writing techniques together are how George R.R. Martin makes A Song of Ice and Fire truly epic in scale. And funnily enough, it has nothing to do with the setting or the plot or characters or themes. It is all technical elements of his writing. Just these alone make the books feel epic. So when you do add the actual story of kings and queens, gods, wizards, and dragons, that's when you have one of the greatest epic fantasy series of all time. Thank you for watching. If you liked this video, you'll probably like the next video on screen, as all I do on this channel is just analyze the lessons from great writing. See you there.